Welcome back to Plenary Session, Malignant Book Club edition. This is the Malignant Book Club. I'm joined by Dr. Timothy Olivier. Timothy, it's great to see you again.
Great to see you, Vinay. How are you?
I'm doing well. This time we're not in the Swiss Alps. This isn't the Swiss Alps edition. This is the cool San Francisco Bay Area edition.
First, congratulations for your new headquarters. That's
the headquarters.
Wonderful, yeah.
Yes, the Plenary Session headquarters is a work in progress. People don't know, but it's really pieced together with Scotch tape and a little bit of lighting deception. So it's good to have you on this side of the table. It's good to talk about Malignant, the book. This is how bad policy and bad evidence harm people with cancer. And where did we leave off in this book club discussion?
So I think it's the fourth episode today. Mm-hmm. So we leave off at the middle part of the conflict of interest part. That was, I think, a very important part of the book, even if some may disagree with that.
Yeah.
And we talk about that during the last episode.
Even though.
So today we will be...
Some haters.
We'll be finishing this part
Yeah.
and another chapter 8 about precision oncology, and then the second part of the book will be closed, and next episode we'll speak about the third part of the book, about medical evidence and trial design. And
my third part is my favorite part.
It's my favorite part also.
It's my favorite
chapter
part.
10.
Yeah, chapter 10,
Yeah.
chapter 11, 12. Okay, so let's pick up here, financial conflict of
Yeah.
interest. I remember the feedback I was telling you somebody said to me was they said that, the book's great, but you don't need that second part. You don't need the financial. And then I said, that's the real key part. I don't know. Why is it key? Because to really understand how a system could permit this kind of deviation from common sense and medical evidence, you need to see how the money flows, because that's the root motivation for why it deviates from, I think, what's really in the patient's best interest. All right, you have questions. I've not had the chance to see these questions. I'm going in blind.
Yeah, so it's a single blind.
Single blind study. Single blind.
Yeah, single blind. So basically, last time we saw the rate, how often it was, for instance, in the NCCN guidelines, expert, how often they were conflicted, how often doctors were conflicted. So today we will see why it is important. Do conflict have an impact on the decision we are making? Mm-hmm. This is the main story of this chapter. Mm-hmm. So in this chapter, you start by talking about study that try to estimate for each dollar spent by the industry, what could be the impact of, for instance, on prescription drugs.
Yes, I think there are a number of studies in this vein, and I think I put them in a few buckets. Is there evidence that money to physicians change prescribing patterns? And I think the answer is yes. Is there evidence that money to physicians affects editorial decisions and editorial spin? I think the answer is yes. Is there evidence that money affects the design and conduct of the clinical study? I think the answer is yes. And in these respects, I think money is different than other biases. Everyone always says to me, there are lots of biases. The biggest bias is that everyone wants to make a name for themselves. They always say that. Everyone wants to make a name for yourself. I was like, well, you could make a name for yourself as the person who, brought selinexor to the market, but you can also make a name for yourself, as some have, as a person who smashed selinexor on the rocks, like Aaron Goodman. I think part of his reputation is he's the guy who thinks selinexor is trash. And he's right. He happens to be right. We can have all these biases, but our biases unidirectional. And the thing about money is it's unidirectional in the sense that you only make money from selling product. Aaron Goodman, he can't find a way to turn his bashing of selinexor into money. But if he was a cheerleader for selinexor, he could find a way to turn it into money. He could, work hand in glove with Karyopharm Pharmaceutical. Now, I'm not sure exactly the study that I cited many years ago when I wrote the book, but I think it has something to do with for every X amount of money given to doctors, one prescription is changed.
I think one important point you are making, and this is the core concept, is why the industry would spend this money. They are not spending this money into direct payment to doctors just like that. It's because there is an impact, and this has been quantified in many studies, as you said. In some studies, you see that for this amount of, maybe for $10,000, you can have this higher prescription in the 3 following months.
Yeah.
And you have many, many examples like that. So this is just a proof, and even one meal can affect. If you are offered a meal, this can affect your prescription. So everything you will receive from the industry can affect your prescription.
Absolutely. And I think that's been shown in a number of studies. And that's different than other biases that don't have the evidence base of financial conflict of interest as a bias. Financial conflict of interest is a bias the way smoking is a carcinogen. There are other carcinogens. I'm sure that there are lots of other carcinogens out there, but smoking is just a well-demonstrated carcinogen, and financial conflict is a well-demonstrated link to bias. It's a great return on investment. I mean, you're buying off doctors cheap.
I just give an example you provide here. For every $13 paid, this led to 3 months more prescription, a study by Fleischmann and colleagues in 2016. Mm-hmm. So, and many other examples like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you'd be a fool to think that a very smart and clever biopharmaceutical industry is doing this for charity. It's not a charity, it's a return on investment. And they get great return on investment. They get return on investment when they detail the doctors writing the prescriptions, but most of the chapter is I'm concerned with not the average doctor writing one Revlimid at a time. I'm concerned with the doctors who are writing the guidelines on when to give Revlimid, the doctors who are deciding what clinical trials to run in the cooperative groups and how to run the studies, and when to unblind everyone and cross everyone over, as what happened with the Revlimid smoldering myeloma study. The moment they had a PFS benefit, they were supposed to run that study for OS, which is the important endpoint when you treat early. We'll talk about, I think, chapter 10.
Yeah.
But they crossed everyone over. So what happens when you have an ecosystem where all the doctors are conflicted? They may even do decisions that harm patients' knowledge, as happened in that case. Now, I can't prove that the financial conflict led to them make that decision, but it doesn't help. And in fact, in aggregate, you can prove that decisions are influenced by the money.
Now another question.
Yeah.
What we do, so we know there are conflict of interest in medicine. We saw that in the previous chapter. What we do about conflict of interest? Is it recognized as problematic? What are the rules? You compare this with politics in this chapter, but maybe we won't have to do that. But what we do, what is the rule?
I mean, I think that the only thing society has been willing to do, American society more than European society, is disclosure and transparency, to put sunshine on it. In the United States, we have the Sunshine Clause, which is a part of the Affordable Care Act, which says that anybody who is a doctor who bills Medicare and also receives money from a for-profit company that sells a drug or device has to have those payments logged in a system by the drug and device company. Now, there are errors in there, of course, because people have things wrongly attributed to their name, and also payments go there that are missed from the system. There's also the fact that the companies can pass the money through one of these predatory publication outlets or these CME activities that is a thin veneer for independence, which is no such thing. It is just the company passing the money through and giving it to the doctor. That's not coded in the system. This is disclosure, sunshine. It's considered by many to be, the least you could do about a problem. And then there are other steps from that. One is, I think, recusal. Beyond a certain amount of money, you're no longer allowed to do some things. And for many years, the New England Journal of Medicine had a policy that if you took more than $10,000 per annum from one company, you are not eligible to be the editorialist for that company or its rival company's products. So you are recused from that. Now, we published a paper, I believe I published this with Victoria Kaesner, where we found that rule was violated a few times. Yeah. That was many years ago. That's called the de minimis rule. Now, why $10,000? They pulled that out of nowhere. It's arbitrary, but beyond 10,000, I think we can all agree we're talking about real money. But I think for most Americans, even less than 10,000, 5,000, that's real money. And these are payments given to doctors, not to the university. Here, we're talking exclusively about general payments to the doctor's purse, the doctor's wallet. And these payments are made in addition to the salary, typically good salary, they earn from working. In Europe, there's no transparency at all. People have to voluntarily disclose. But I don't know how much money people are getting. In the U.S., there is this sunshine clause. No one, besides a handful of instances, fight for recusal. And then the best thing you could do about it is to have an ethos or system where we really go separate ways, which is that, look, you can work for the company in this world. You're free to do that. You can go work for Merck and get stock options. Or you can be the academic who works on ECOG, designing the studies, and writing the guidelines, in which case, maybe you shouldn't be the person who's also taking money from Merck. And then the last point I'll make is, if you work for Merck, the rule is stricter for you than it is for me at UCSF. Because if you work for Merck, you can't take money from Pfizer. They're not going to like that. Yeah. But a university professor can take money from everybody, every single company. And that's ridiculous.
There's a thing that I think it's important also. this money doctors are receiving direct payment. It's not publicized.
It's not public.
And as an example, when people give a lecture, for instance, in ASCO, they have to disclose a financial conflict of interest at the beginning of the talk.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about that? Because you published a study and it was very interesting. How fast this is presented, and maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, so
I think it's interesting because it's also, kind of a false sense of we are disclosing, but actually we are not really disclosing if we don't have the time to read the disclosure.
Yeah. So I think it was 2014, 2015, I was at ASCO, and then they're like, the next talk is going to be a phase 1-2 study, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, I'd like to thank the conference organization. I'd like to thank these are my disclosures here. And the slide is gone. I was like, whoa. And then I saw the whole slide was just full of text. These are my disclosures. And it's gone. And so I asked Aaron Boothby, who was, I think at the time, a third-year medical student. I think now the good Dr. Boothby is a first-year fellow at Fred Hutch, Seattle, Washington. And he's a very smart kid. Very smart physician. Now he's a doctor. He's on his own now. So he came to me looking for a project. I thought this project was well suited for him. He downloaded the videos of hundreds of these kind of presentations from ASCO, educational sessions and also research sessions. He downloaded the video of oral presenters. He timed how long the slide was up, and I think there is some bare minimum time that they had at the time.
Yeah, that's some metric. I think.
In
1 second you can read 4 words, and you were very permissive.
So he timed how long the slide was up. He counted how many words on the slide, so he can say basically, in order to read this slide, you need to read X words per minute or X words per second. And we know from the published literature that people who proofread, people who read, people who are really fast readers, the fastest the average person might read is 4 words per second. In fact, that's like really good. Most of us don't even read 4 words per second. Actually, most of us don't read at all. But few of us who do read, we don't read 4 words per second. Okay, it's pretty fast. So we're asking a very simple question, which is how many slides were flashed at a rate faster than the average super reader can read? And the answer was, if I recall, that 38%.
Yeah, absolutely.
38%. Yeah. 40% of these were flashed so damn fast, you couldn't even read it if you were a speed reader. Now, what does that mean to me? It means that this is a token gesture. Oh, yeah, we have to disclose that all these people, they're giving us such a hard time. So here you go. Here's your disclosure. Boom, it's gone. Okay, now we're going to talk about, the spin cycle. That to me is unfair. It's really not in the spirit of things.
Yeah. So on that positive note, what are the solutions?
I think though they fixed this problem. Didn't they?
Okay.
No. I think ASCO actually read our paper. It's published in JAMA Oncology, and I think that they have now. Somebody told me, the timer on it is like it really makes it sit up there for a long time because because of my paper, because of Boothby's paper. But that's not the real solution. I mean.
So when it comes to solution, I think it was important first to see the problems, because the solution can be seen as a pretty drastic. But can you maybe explain what would be your solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different levels of solution you could choose from. You could choose, I think, the current status quo, which is doing almost nothing at all, and might even be worse than doing nothing because we absolve our conscience and don't solve the bias problem. And in fact, a number of studies, including studies by, I think, Sa from NYU Business School, show that disclosure leads to a false sense of trust in the person who's disclosed, even when they go on to perpetuate the biased statements. So I think disclosure is not a great solution. That's the status quo. What we're doing might be worse than nothing at all. Okay, you could go to level 1. We're going to do some things. You could go to level 2. We're going to do other things. And you can go to what I think the world should be. Level 3, we're going to do a lot. We could talk about the different levels. I think Vincent Raj Kumar and I once wrote sort of a level 1, some common sense, basic things that we could all do that would be an improvement. I want to defend for a little bit what I think the absolute position should be, which is it should be, I hate to say it, but there's no reason that a doctor, and by the way, the majority of academic hematology oncology doctors in this country, the most lowly paid instructor is probably making 3 times the average household income, in America. That's the most lowly paid. And the average doctor is probably making 4 or 5 times the average household income. And some of these people who are very senior, ironically, the ones with the most payments, they're making, many, many times more than the average household income. Now, I know you live in an expensive city. I know San Francisco. I know all these places are expensive. I know there's not a single person, I think, no matter how wealthy they are, who doesn't think it would be nice to have a little bit more money. I mean, I think money is this kind of thing, at least in the ballpark that we all live in. Maybe if you're a 100 billionaire, it doesn't matter. I don't know. I couldn't imagine that. But most people want more money. So I get that you want more money. I get that you feel like you're underpaid. I get that you feel like if I worked for pharma, I would be paid better. I get all those things. But I think you have to make choices in life. And if your choice is you want to be the impartial arbiter of what's best for patients, you cannot take money from for-profit entities with unidirectional interests. And I'm not saying you can't find other ways to make money. You can't, take up woodworking, or you can't be a piano player. And I'm not saying it's not about making money per se. It's that this particular type of financial arrangement where you are getting money from certain companies that only profit from doing one thing and not the other, that is a very, very problematic arrangement if your core job is to impartially assess products.
Okay. I will
push back.
Make the usual pushback, and I know what you will be answering to that, but do you mean we have it's forbidden to talk to the industry, to work with the industry? What does it mean? And do you speak about direct payment and also research payment? Maybe this distinction is important.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the straw man people say is that, if we can't talk to pharma, we can't collaborate. You and I must have published 10 or 20 papers together. You never cut me a check for $10,000.
Yeah, that's right.
You can talk to people. I talk everybody.
In the book, you said you even don't know if you get a coffee. I think I give you a coffee.
Yeah, I think you probably bought me a coffee over the years. You probably did buy me a coffee. I think I bought you a coffee.
Yeah,
we bought each other coffee. So that's our financial disclosure. But my point is that actually most of the people I've co-authored papers with, the first author in these papers, I don't think I bought them coffee. I don't think they bought me coffee. Especially in Mercy.
That's what you wrote.
That's yeah. I mean, I think they didn't even buy me coffee. No offense. I'm not looking for coffee. Okay, I have plenty of coffee. But my point is that, one, it is factually untrue that you have to exchange money to work together. We have worked together. You work with your students. You work with your colleagues. You are not exchanging money with everybody you work together. It's possible to just work together with people. Okay, it's possible. And second of all, I understand that in the current ecosystem, in the last part of the book, we'll talk about how to shift some of these things, but in the current ecosystem, the bulk way in which we fund trials is the company gives money to the university, and the university uses that money to run the trial. I am not saying stop that. I'm saying that in addition to that, the company has an ad board. The ad board is in a swanky hotel in swanky city. The ad board flies everyone there, business class maybe. The ad board puts them up for a very nice dinner. The ad board gives them a check for $2,000, $5,000, $1,000, $6,000, $7,000. You can look up the payments, And my point is that you don't need to take that $5,000. You can still meet with them at ASCO. You can still have a Zoom call with them. You can still get money in your research account and use that money to run the trial. You can still work with them and talk to them and be their friend. They don't have to give you the check for your personal bank account for $5,000. That's not necessary.
Did you ever give a lecture to the pharma?
Oh, it's hot under these lights. Yeah, but I think I maybe mentioned the book. I have given 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, I've given multiple lectures at major top 10, top 20 biopharmaceutical firms. Some on Zoom, unfortunately, because of this hellhole we live in, this hellhole of Zoom. But some in person before. And the one I went in person, not only did I not take their money, to give the talk.
Yeah, about the coffee.
Yeah, I took my own coffee in my own thermos. I packed coffee so that I wouldn't have to accept their coffee and have that payment added to me. Now, what's my point here? My point here is that and also, why are they asking me to talk? They're asking me to talk because I had published, a couple hundred papers, and there are papers about drug development and how you can think about drug development and places that we might have some areas of mutual interest, which I think we do, which is that I want more drugs to be developed that work, and so do they. And so it was a fruitful dialogue, and I had meetings with lots of people who work at these companies, and I have a different point of view on a lot of issues, and I know how to think about data in different ways than most people think, and so I think there was some value to them. But, again, I didn't take a check I'm sure I could have gotten them to give me some check. I didn't need that check because I have a job, and that check would put me in a forever impossible position, which is how am I going to fairly criticize their products and fairly give them credit where credit is due, which I do as well on the channel. There was something recently.
Dostarlimab.
Dostarlimab, yeah. I gave credit to Dostarlimab. And the original Pfizer vaccine. I gave credit and I ran to get the first dose in my arm, you know? So for me to be able to give credit to Pfizer for the Pfizer vaccine, for me to be able to credit to the makers of dostarlimab, and actually I forget which company makes, I forget.
Dostarlimab, I don't know.
I forget either. I think Eisai, maybe, Japanese company? No, maybe, I don't know. Whoever makes dostarlimab, you know, I need to be impartial, you know, so I can say dostarlimab good and Shine garbage, you know, and Shine is garbage, you know, so, yeah.
Yeah, I think, in other words, your point, your solution would be that doctors should not receive direct payment from the industry, right?
Yeah.
You detail some points in details, but that's
part of the core solution. The things that Vincent and I have talked about is to set limits on it and to recuse yourself from NCCN and editorials if you do, you know, because I don't think he's where I am. And so that's a compromise. I'm happy to take a compromise because I'd rather have half a loaf of bread than no loaf at all. And to me, I do think there's a generation of oncologists that is too far gone. These KOLs who are very old, you know, who are senior. I don't want to say old, they're not always old. But typically I'm talking about people who've worked in oncology for more than 20 years as a PI. And if you worked for more than 20 years and you're typically earning over $100,000 per year, it's going to be very difficult to get this person unaddicted to the product. But my focus is more on the junior people. I see junior people all the time. They come, they say that they care about patients. I know they do. They say they care about things that people didn't care about before. Disparity, equity. They care about these things, which are so important and so unfair in cancer. They care about disparity, equity. They care about the vulnerable patients. They care about palliative care, early palliative care. They care about all these really important things. And they are also taking $20,000, $30,000 from AstraZeneca, $30,000 from these companies. You don't need to start down that road. You can stop. You can care about these things and not become addicted because you can't really do both well, I think.
I think it's going to your last point of the chapter, and that's good you are talking about that. The title is "There Aren't Bad People."
Yeah.
And you are talking about the system more than really people and people and people. So maybe the culture and the system has to be reformed.
Yeah.
I think this will be very difficult, honestly, because there's so much money at stake. But how do you want to conclude this chapter? I think it's a very important chapter. Those two chapters are very important because they are explaining all the pitfalls, flaws that we will be describing in details in other chapters, because there's so much money at stake. I mean,
so much money. I know. I mean, I think, you know, when you and I talk, we always talk about like the reason that it's so hard to fix some of these problems, the reason that, you know, they run the trial. The control arm is clearly not what they would give their own mother. We point that out online. And then the first thing is rationalizing excuses, you know. Oh, well, you know, the place they ran this trial, you know, they don't have access to those drugs. I was like, yeah, I know. But they're doing this trial there to get regular approval here. And the moment the trial finishes there, they don't keep giving those drugs there. And Mani has proven some of these things in a recent paper.
Yeah, very good paper.
That those drugs are not even approved in those countries, that they have preyed upon, predatorized. You know, they've exploited that country. Yeah. And then you mean to tell me that the person whose job is health equity and fairness, global fairness, they are taking money from the company that just exploited all these global sites. Unbelievable to me. And I guess what I want to say is, I do think people are good. Like, it's not, and every single person who's participating in this system, they believe their actions are justifiable. It's what my teacher did. It's what my mentor did. It's okay to do this. It's for the greater good. It's for bringing drugs to patients. It's justified. What I'm trying to say is that even when you believe your heart is gold, you can end up in a system that does a lot of bad to a lot of people. And, you know, that's what, I mean, the lesson of so many structural biases is in the world is that a lot of good people participated in a system where, you know, unrelated, but, you know, we incarcerated a lot of people for carrying trivial amounts of marijuana on them. That wasn't a good policy. Now, was every single person involved in that evil? No, a lot of people were caught up following rules that other people created. And the whole system had to be broken. And it's still not fully fixed, but, you know, at least people are starting to recognize that it's a problem. Similarly, in oncology, the problem is that we are developing drugs that help people. Some are great, some are modest, and some are marginal. But all of these products, and somewhat irrespective of how good they are, can earn billions and billions and billions of dollars. And they reallocate capital from lots of people to very few people. And the moment you have a system that reallocates so much capital, it will be preyed upon, it will be taken advantage of. And as a doctor, the least you should try, you should aspire to not making the problem worse and trying to make the problem better.
I will ask you a last question on this topic.
Yeah.
It's a bit in the same spirit, but are you optimist about the evolution of this, and what would be the next step, for instance? What would be the next step?
That's a good question.
Because we are speaking about conflict of interest and the impact and how it can influence outcomes in trials since maybe 1, 2, 3 decades. I mean, we know this problem since long.
Yeah. I guess like so many people who see problems for which there are solutions, I wax between being incredibly optimistic and incredibly pessimistic. I think I go the spectrum. Now, I think one thing that gives me a lot of optimism is I know there's lots of junior people who are fans of this show, and they're fans of they're fans of this work, and they're doing some of this work their own, and they're carrying the torch in different ways. And I'm in touch with a lot of them, and privately they agree with a lot of these points. And so I do think that there's going to be a new generation of people with a higher fraction of people who are attuned to these issues. And that's one of the legacies of the book. That's a good legacy. So I think that's positive. Now, I will say there are places where I disagree with even the junior people. I think a lot of the junior people believe that they will be able to build a name for themselves in oncology in the traditional way, running trials in some tumor type or the other. And doing so in a more ethical way, pushing insofar as they can for better control arms, better post-protocol care, no misuse of crossover, etc. And then once they get to a position of prominence, they'll be able to try to further encourage better trials. That's their view.
I see.
And I wish them the best in this goal, but that's not my view of how you're going to solve the problem. I think that we will, you're just going to be sort of dabbling around the edges in this way. And if you really want to solve the problem, I think it's going to require political action, congressional action, and that medicine is no longer at the point where the profession can self-regulate. And I guess that's the dispute. The dispute is the people who are in the field, do we believe the profession can correct itself as professions are meant to do? And I think if it weren't for the Sunshine Clause and the Affordable Care Act, there would never have been a Sunshine Clause. Proof of that is it doesn't happen in Europe. Okay. So what did it take? It took Chuck Grassley, and it took, who's a Republican, by the way, who on the one issue of Sunshine is very progressive. It took Grassley. He didn't like government waste, and he helped push that into law. What will I think the next steps is? I think it's not too hard to believe that once we get to 1/4 of GDP spent on healthcare, catastrophic spending on healthcare, once we get to the new generation of the aducanumab 2.0, 3.0, 4.0.
We are not far.
We're not far.
Yeah.
Once we get to this kind of horrific spending, people seeing their tax money just shoveled into wheelbarrows and taken to rich people's houses and dumped in exchange for products that don't work. When we see more and more of this, there will be a public outcry that says my wages are not going up.
Coming from people.
My premiums are not going up. You bastards are not giving me a fair shake. You're taking all my money to pay for healthcare that doesn't make me healthier because it doesn't even work because you're powering for endpoints that are trivial, etc. And then that pressure will be put on Congress people. And I think the simple ways in which they'll be able to get a quick fix is to, I think the easy one would be, anybody who bills Medicare, we will ban you from personal financial payments from companies that bill Medicare as well. The same thing that's in Sunshine Act, except it's banned. And I think they will take that action. I think they will take NCCN, which is a compendia, which we'll talk about, and they'll pull it out. I think they'll take some of these actions, and what I'm suggesting is that some of their actions will have unintended consequences. You may not like all their actions. If you want to avert that, you best fix the problem yourself. But as we see, year after year, they, the professional societies don't fix they don't want to fix it, and the less and less you want to fix it from within the profession, the more and more you will invite a heavy-handed political action against you.
I see.
And that's what I think will happen.
So thank you for your thoughts about this very important topic, and we'll continue with the last chapter of this part. I don't remember the name of the part. It's societal forces.
The social forces that shape medicine or something. Yeah. Shape cancer medicine. Section 2.
The last chapter is about. It's called
Precision.
Will Precision Oncology Save Us?
Yeah.
And at the introduction, I think it's very interesting because you recall the example of intensity of chemotherapy that was the kind of paradigm for some years, maybe some decades. And there was some pushback. You give the example at the introduction of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And nowadays we are in another paradigm. Maybe you can talk about it. And maybe the definition of precision oncology, you made some work. At the time of the book, the recent work with Ajit Tran was not published, but I think it's a very interesting, maybe we can talk about also.
Yeah.
The definition, what is precision oncology, what is personalized medicine, the different definition. Can you talk about that?
So one thing I think that listeners should know is that this issue has diffused a little bit in the last few years. But when the book was written in 2018, it was at fever pitch. I mean, the mantra of precision oncology was all you heard about, which is that it is only a matter of time before which we sequence everybody who has cancer, and each individual person will get an individual combination of drugs, like a lock and key, which will, make their cancer shrink and never come back. Like this perfect magic solution. And I think that's the sort of motivating spirit, but it's meant many things. One thing precision oncology means is among all the people who present with a new diagnosis of advanced or metastatic cancer, how many of those people are eligible for a treatment that is guided based on sequencing, where you look for an ALK rearrangement, you drug it if you have non-small cell lung cancer, for instance. And the answer to that was maybe, 5 years ago, nobody knew. People talked as if it will be everybody someday. And then finally, in a couple of papers, one by John Marquardt and myself in JAMA Oncology in 2018, a follow-up with Alison Haslam and myself in the Annals of Oncology in 2020, we showed that it was 8-point-some%, went up to like 10-point-some% or 12-point-some%. It's the paucity.
And this was people eligible for.
So in other words, based on the frequency with which tumors occur and the frequency with which mutations occur within those tumors and the FDA package approvals to date, we're talking about 1 in 10 people are even eligible. And in contrast, checkpoint inhibitors was 4 out of 10, and cytotoxics were 8 out of 10. So precision, or at least genomic therapy, only even affected a tiny fraction of cancer patients with advanced or metastatic disease. And in the adjuvant setting, it was even less.
And also there's a distinction between, for instance, in this paper and this work, you studied how many patients were eligible for FDA-approved therapy. And another definition of precision oncology is the goal would be to sequence every patient, and even beyond FDA-approved drugs, could you match patient with the drug, with the mutation, and what would be the outcome?
Yeah. So I think like the first thing is like FDA-approved genomic, and in fact, if anything, that's the place where there's greatest validation. But recently, Allison and I did another follow-up paper where we asked how many of those have shown an overall survival benefit, and it was very, very few. They're mostly approved on the basis of response rate. Now, I have no doubt that a drug like alectinib, I have no doubt that that some of these targeted drugs improve overall survival. Sure, I mean, absolutely the case. ALK drugs and lung cancer and EGFR drugs, etc. But some drugs, I genuinely wonder, Dabtram in BRAF V600 lung cancer, I don't know. Do you really need it up front? Could you give it third line and get the same effect? We don't know. We don't have randomized data. Some of these are rather modest drugs. So my point there is that they're not all these miraculous home runs. The other point is that beyond the approved options, there's this new mantra, molecular tumor boards. You take somebody whose cancer has progressed on many lines of therapy, and you put them in a molecular tumor board. They sequence them, proteome them, whatever ohm them, ohm, and maybe they say ohm a few times on top of, they get the biome and say ohm. Omics. And then they come up with some personalized cocktail, a little pazopanib for you, a little tivozanib for you, a little pembro, axi for you, whatever. They come up with some cocktail. And that strategy was to some degree validated by regulators when CMS decided to pay for Foundation Medicine F1CDX in every single patient with advanced or metastatic cancer at least once. But it was always an unproven strategy. And, I've published articles in the Annals of Oncology calling for a randomized controlled trial, testing whether or not everybody needs to be sequenced or whether or not sequencing can be used more sparingly, which is the standard of care as I see it. And that, to me, is the most unproven part of precision oncology. I want to make one more point.
Yeah.
What is personalized medicine was precision medicine.
Yeah.
We used to call this personalized oncology, but then Harold Varmus made a really interesting point, which is that medicine has always been personalized. When his father was dying, the doctor, he didn't come up with a treatment for anybody. It was for his father. based on his father, how tall he was, what he weighed, how he could tolerate medicines, his kidney function. We've always personalized medicine, with the exception of boosters. But with the exception of boosters, which has to be one size fits all.
Well, in oncology.
Yeah. Right. We've always personalized medicine. But precision presumably means you're personalizing on the basis of molecular characteristics and or omics.
Yeah, fair point. So personalized medicine, precision oncology, and so these terms are growingly used.
Oh, you want to talk about that paper we wrote about definition changing?
Yeah, with Audrey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, originally it was an idea that Robert Peter Gale and I
ASCO
had,
Post, yeah.
and we wrote in the ASCO Post. And then later, Audrey Tran, who was a terrific medical student, worked with me, and she solidified the idea, took it further. But basically, the idea was simple. If you take the biomedical literature and you sample the term precision oncology in different time periods, and then you code, what do the authors mean by precision oncology? What happens? And the answer is, precision oncology, the vernacular, the term, has undergone clonal evolution just like a cancer cell. In circa 2005 to 2010, it was seldom used. And when it was used, people said things like Gleevec or erlotinib in EGFR mutant lung cancer were... Bevacizumab was even precision oncology, some targeted drug.
Yeah.
But then you sample in the next period of time, and it means things like where you drug, you look for alkyl rearrangement, and if and only if it's present, you give it. That was what it meant.
I think the second part was mostly the FDA-approved drug. For instance, EGFR in lung, ALK in lung.
Yeah, and that's the FDA-approved one. And then the most recent meaning of it is you take someone's tumor and you grow it in fly avatars and you drug all the flies. Which fly responds, you give it to the person. Or you sequence everything and you come with a unique combo.
What we call agnostic.
Tissue agnostic.
Tissue agnostic, yeah.
But it's even more than that. When Audrey did her paper, which I think is in BMC Open or BMJ Open.
Yeah, BMJ Open 2020, yeah.
She has a Euler diagram which shows the evolution, and you literally see, some things gain popularity over years and then fade away. There's entirely novel concepts that pop up, and it's a living thing. I mean, language is alive, and this language is shifting and shape-shifting. Why does I think that matters? Where people come up to me and said, back in 2015, you were a great skeptic of precision oncology. Look at you wrong. Now it's working. And then I say, you've literally changed the definition. We were talking about something different back then. I was always a critic that everybody, when they progress on every drug, could undergo sequencing and you come up with some novel cocktail that benefits them. And I remain yet to be proved that actually benefits them versus just picking a salvage drug based on, phase 2 study and based on what's been tried and true in that cancer.
There's an interesting part you're talking about here is the super responders and anecdotes.
Yeah.
We already talked about that in previous chapters, but can you maybe... you did 2 work on that space, and I think it was really interesting. And recently, the iceberg plot it was a bit on the same topic. But can you just explain what is super responder, what you find when you study these reports? So the first report was with Andre van Ross, and you find 32 super responders, and you study the literature, what data were present or no, and actually you find that in 20% of cases, there were no data on the previous therapy the patient had received. And I think that's very important.
Yeah.
Maybe you can expand on that, about the biology of the tumor.
Yeah. So I think one justification for that this idea that everybody should be sequenced after they progress on approved drugs and get some cocktail is that every so often when you do that, you have a quote unquote super responder. These are people who they've gotten a bunch of approved therapy. Now we finally learned that they have activating mutations or inactivating mutations in TSC1 or something like that. And we give them an mTOR inhibitor and they do super, super well. They do much better than you'd expect. It's the 7th drug they get, but they do really well on this drug. And this idea of super responders was, very sexy. It gained a lot of prominence. It was the substance of science papers. And, what we did was what I often do as a meta-researcher, which is sort of an umbrella overview of everything available. First, Andre and I, we did a literature review of every single super responder case that had ever been documented at the time, which is now 7 years ago. So since then, the literature has exploded. A few years later, Jia Lu, who's now at the Dana-Farber, Go Nishikawa, who's now in Minnesota, Hemonc fellow, and myself, we updated this with hundreds of cases. But basically, we said, let's just collect everybody who's ever reported a case that they believe the person did super good on a super new drug. Okay, let's make all those cases. the first question I want to know when I think about somebody who's, you're telling me they've done super well, is how well did they do with the last drug? Is this the kind of person who did really, really well with all the drugs they've been treated and they're still doing well with all the drugs? Is their tumor indolent or pan-sensitive biology? Or is this the kind of person whose tumors was rip-roaring, progressive, and now finally they're doing well? And I remember one case I read early on that made me think about this. It was a woman with anaplastic thyroid cancer, and I think she had a ROS1 alteration or something like that. She got crizotinib. She did well. She took it for like 6 months. And I said, you know what? In anaplastic thyroid cancer, you don't see a lot of durations of treatments in relapse anaplastic thyroid cancer of 6 months. It's very rare. The median survival is 4 months with that disease. But then I looked at the person's case report, and I saw that before they got this novel drug, they had anaplastic thyroid cancer for 2 years. They were already at the 99th percentile of biology. Who put them there? Not the person who gave the drug, but, it was God or, nature put them there. They were already there.
The nature of the disease, in a sense,
Yeah.
is different for these patients than other patients. Yeah.
They were not the average anaplastic thyroid cancer. And so they were probably going to respond well to whatever you were to give them. And so anyway, so we did this paper.
Yeah, in this paper, in the updated paper, you find that the median duration of treatment was 14 months.
Which is good.
But the median of the previous therapy was 8 months, which is also good. And you apply the Von Hoff criteria. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah.
And when you apply this criteria, it was less than half patient that met this criteria.
Yeah, and I think that the median of the medians is a mix of true super responder cases and flimsy ones, and so that's why it actually kind of looks better than what you'd expect. But the flimsy ones was like they were doing really well, and it's just the duration of treatment shrinking. What is a Von Hoff thing? Daniel Von Hoff had, many sort of innovative things in oncology. One thing he had was the idea that for you to say you did super well on a new drug, your PFS on that new drug has to be at least 1.3 times better than your most recent PFS. If it was just the same as your prior PFS, that's not as impressive. If it was 1.3 times better, it's a modest threshold. If it was 3 times better or 4 times better, that's great. But 1.3 times is set as a modest benchmark. And we found about 50% of super responder stories could not even clear the Von Hoff threshold. And then the last point I want to make is, you want to talk about Fermi estimates? Or?
Oh, yeah, you can.
Well, I got very interested in this and in the weeds, and I don't know if listeners will be interested, but here's the gist of it. For many years, consulting firms asked the candidates a question that was very difficult to answer in a consulting interview. One such question was, how many piano tuners are there in Chicago? And the person answering that question has to make a guess. How many piano tuners are there in Chicago? But, how are they going to get to this number? And the answer is a very simple way to estimate something that you may not initially feel like you know the answer to is to estimate what you do know, round it to the nearest 10 to the power of, and then do some math. So what might you say is you might say, there's like 8 million or 10 million people in Chicago, 10 to the power of 8. There's, so many people who have a piano. Piano's got to tune so often. And round everything to the nearest 10 to the power of, and do the math, and then you might say something like, by dividing all these numbers, it comes to roughly, there's 1,000 piano tuners or 100 piano tuners. Like the nearest order of magnitude for how many piano tuners there are in Chicago. And I forget what it works out to. But it turns out that it's actually quite close to the real number. And this was named after Enrico Fermi, and it's called the Fermi estimate, where you round everything to the nearest 10 to the power of, and suddenly you can make a pretty decent estimate of this concept that you initially may not feel like you know that much to. Because sometimes you round down and sometimes you round up, and these kind of biases cancel each other out. And what I sought to do with the super responder thing was make that same point, which is that we do have some sense of the denominator, how many people have undergone broad NGS sequencing. And at the time of our studies, we're talking about 100,000, 200,000 people.
Yeah.
And we also know how many super responder cases we find in the biomedical literature in Google Scholar, which is a very in-depth citation database, and it was 200-ish. So that leads me to believe that super responders occur roughly 1 in 1,000 times.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably pretty right.
Yeah, you know that. Yeah, I remember. It was very interesting. How did you get interested in this kind of estimate?
I think sometimes you watch random YouTube videos and you learn something, or you read some random books and you learn something.
So maybe to conclude on this topic, and maybe we didn't talk about that. Why is it frequent that we talk about precision oncology? Is it Are there a lot of funding? Are there a lot of trials? I mean, is it frequent? Is it very often you encounter that in your practice, or it's not so frequent?
I mean, I think if you recall, like when the book was written, the hottest thing under the sun was precision oncology. You know, it felt like every paper in Nature Medicine was about precision oncology and sequencing. I think the last few years and the pandemic has taken the steam out of these precision oncologists. You know, they've shown the limits of what they've been able to achieve. The interest has moved heavily to CAR T therapy, which I talk a little bit about in the book, because we just had tisagenlecleucel when I wrote it, but CAR T is getting a lot of the attention.
Also, maybe other drug like antibody drug conjugate.
Antibody drug conjugate is getting attention with trastuzumab deruxtecan. But back in these days, and this was, I think, we shouldn't forget, this was the peak of Baselga. Baselga was the physician-in-chief of Sloan Kettering. Baselga took massive resources to have the MSKCC impact. He was sequencing everybody, and he was defending it. And of course, you know, I think the year the book was written was when David Hyman and I debated each other at AACR. Baselga was the moderator. Yeah. It's quite a fun time.
Can you recall it?
Yeah, I recall. I remember some shouting was there. I guess I'd say, you know, it was something that doesn't happen too often these days. It was a good old-fashioned debate. The debate was, I forget the exact proposition, but, precision oncology is more hope than hype, or hype than hope, or something like that. David Hyman, who's now, I think, the chief medical officer at Loxo and Lilly, you know, but back then he was the section chief of phase 1 at MSKCC. He debated the side that there's more hope than there is hype, and I think I debated the opposite side. Unbeknownst to David Hyman, in the weeks preceding the debate, John Marquardt and I worked very, very hard to write an article about estimating the upper bound benefit of genome-driven cancer therapies, which we published in JAMA Oncology, and we timed the publication of the article the moment the debate was to take place, which was kind of a little showman trump card that I had at the time of the debate. David made his argument, I made my argument. My argument ended with this kind of, and by the way, we've quantified it, and it is actually 8.3%, which is quite low. Ergo, I'm correct. There's more objectively, numerically, hype than hope. And then, of course, Jose, you know, he was quite taken aback, and he had a lot to say. But you know what? As much as he was a passionate guy, and as often as his temper got the best of him, you know, I do miss the time not that long ago where you could go to a conference and have a really heated debate. And now, as we see elsewhere, which I won't get into, but you see, you know, people are protesting speakers who only 97% agree with them. You see, nobody wants to debate anything. They all want, you know, we'll just have people who agree on this issue. There's a series in oncology called The Great Debates, but they get people on both sides who always agree, you know? And so I guess for all the limits and faults of a really heated, passionate debate, wouldn't you, the audience, by the way, you out there, you go to this conference, you know how boring it is. Wouldn't you rather hear a heated debate than what they're giving right now? The content is boring. I have almost fallen asleep in some of these oral sessions. It's so boring. I would pay money to see somebody make it have some spice. And there's a lot of spice because there's a lot of things in medicine that are unclear.
And there's a lot of gray zone. I mean, there's a lot of place where you can debate honestly and you don't have the correct answer. You're not sure you have the correct answer.
Absolutely.
To conclude, you give the example how you would assess if this definition of precision oncology, we talk about the last definition, how would you assess if it's efficient or no? And you give the example of two type of trials. I think people won't be surprised that you would want a randomized clinical trial.
Of course. I think these days nobody's surprised I want a randomized trial. I mean, I think maybe it's worth pointing out, like, why do I want randomized trials? I hope at this point, when you've read the book this far, and the reason that I make a nod to autologous stem cell transplant for breast cancer is you do, I hope, understand why you need randomized trials. We have been misled over and over and over again into doing things that are invasive, costly, harmful, that make us feel like we're helping the patient that did no such thing. When we don't do randomized studies, when we allow ourselves to be seduced by historical benchmarks and comparisons like this, they're always often misleading. And yet, we never learn. Why do we not learn? Because I guess to some degree, you know, it's easy to make a lot of careers off uncontrolled studies. Soon on this podcast, I'm going to do just talk about a study that is a phase 2 study of 60 people with lymphoma. And they get all this treatment up front and all this treatment.
Smart.
This smart start. And one of the points I'm going to make is that, we had the phase 1 study done. We have dose escalated Len. It didn't meet DLT. That's Wyndham's study. Now, randomize or, shut up. I mean, the next question is not what's the response rate. You know that a response rate in an uncontrolled lymphoma study, it doesn't matter what it is. You'll have no idea if it's better or worse than what you're doing because Rick Fisher in 93, because Pro-Cytobomb once upon a time looked better than CHOP.
We'll be talking about that
in a
next
future chapter. Okay,
yeah.
So we know you can't benchmark these things. We know the only way to know if it's better than what you're doing is to randomize. And similarly, there's so many biases that happen in observational studies of precision oncology.
Yeah.
You're not referring the person with explosive tumors to being sequenced. They can't wait. You're not referring the poorer person, the person in community practice. You're having huge quaternary referral indolent biology bias. You're giving all the sequencing. They have to live long enough to wait for the result, to wait for the molecular tumor board.
And you can't adjust for.
And you can't adjust for that. You can't find a control that's equivalent with the same hardwired biases in it. And for that, you need randomization. You also know the effect size isn't a light switch. It's not like it's not dostarlimab, which is different, where the people appear to be cured. It's not. And proof of that is that in that paper that I published in the Annals of Oncology, calling for a randomized controlled trial, I did the power calculation from their own observational studies, and the hazard ratio that their observational studies generate is 0.65, meaning it's a very modest, 4-month improvement.
Yeah.
That's what the observational literature would have you believe.
Yeah.
So basically what I'm saying is you do a randomized trial. There's 2 different broad strategies. One, you sequence everyone, and then you randomize them to a matched therapy or a therapy picked the old-fashioned way. Or you randomize them to be sequenced or not sequenced and test, does the routine application of sequencing improve outcomes? I actually favor that. That's really a test of what CMS is paying for. Should CMS pay for everyone to get sequenced? Let's randomize them to doing it or not doing it. 1,000 people in each arm, you get the answer. Instead, CMS has spent $2 billion, $2 billion, $2 billion, $2 billion, $2 billion, $2 billion. I think now 6 years of $2 billion of spending. They've spent $12 billion, and they don't know the answer if that's actually generating a return on investment for the beneficiaries of Medicare, which is, in part, they are violating their own statutory authority, which is that they have an obligation to show to do things in the interest of Medicare beneficiaries, not the companies that lobby them. And they could have pushed for a randomized trial. They had the authority, and they did with aducanumab. Actually, this would have been something great. I wrote an article that they should have done what they did for aducanumab 4 years ago. So what's my point here? The broader point. The broader point is in oncology, as elsewhere in medicine, you want to do things that make people better, and you don't want to do things that don't work, that make you think, that deceive you into thinking. Human beings are easily deceived because we're optimistic creatures and hope springs eternal. The only way to separate you fooling yourself from a real effect, when the effect is at best modest or marginal, which, by the way, that's oncology, that's our business, is randomization. And you don't need you don't need smart start benchmarking a response rate. You've sorted out the dosing. You can launch randomized control trials.
I think it's a very, very important point, maybe even more important than when you wrote Malignant.
Yeah.
We can feel in many instances that randomized clinical trials are on the
decline.
Yeah. Many criticism and I start to worried about that. I mean, I mean, obviously listeners of this podcast will know there are a number of non-oncology issues that I have been a vocal spokesperson that we need randomization. I think, maybe right now those views divide people, but in 10 years, in 15 years, when people sober up and think about what we did, they will all agree. How could we have done things year after year affecting millions of people? Not even try to do the one study design that is reliable, and instead rely on just garbage observational after garbage observational, which I have a whole Substack just documenting bad observational study. And what I do think is it's very different than before. And this is what scares me. In my career in medicine, which now is, how many years have I been doing this? 17 years. 17 years I've been in medicine, and maybe 15 of those 17 I've really been in it. Like I've been really invested in reading and thinking about it. And in 15 years, there used to be a force that opposed randomized control trials.
And they were typically for-profit biopharmaceutical companies that did not want those trials to threaten their market share. But you would get the allegiance of the people who care about justice and people who care about cost conscious. You get those people on your side that we need to do these studies. But the pandemic, I think, has changed it a little bit. And now a lot of those people, they think they know the answer. And the reason is that a lot of the questions that they view as pandemic questions are no longer scientific questions, they're moral questions. We know this, quote unquote, saves lives. We don't, but that's the problem. But they think it does. And only a bad person would not want to do this. And they're moving to the side that ergo you cannot test it. And that to me is very dangerous, because when you get the biopharmaceutical industry and the people who care about justice and equality on the same side against randomized controlled trials, there ain't anyone left on the other side who's going to be able to push back. And I do think you see with legislation that we are moving against randomized studies, which is really bad. We're going to be as dumb as we've ever been.
Concerning. That leads me to maybe the last question.
Okay.
Broad thoughts about social forces. I mean, the part 2 is ended now. It was social forces in oncology. Any other thoughts?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first part of the book opens up by showing you that the outcomes for cancer patients aren't as good as you think. And all these new sexy drugs aren't as great as you think. And I think, I don't want to mean my book is in no way similar to any other cancer book out there. I think there's lots of cancer books about the art and practice of oncology. This is not that book. There's also books about the history of oncology that are beautifully written. This is not that book. This is about oncology policy, the real things that we have to think about day in, day out. And I think some of the history books that were very popular in oncology do provide a false idea about the field. They get into hero worship. They make it seem as if it's a series of inexorable progress. There are a few setbacks, but we're heroes solving these things all the time. And I don't think that's quite accurate. I think it's a naive sort of a fresh-eyed look. That's a naive look of the field. I think the truth about oncology is we spend inordinate amounts of money. We do have some success, but we have a lot of mediocrity, a lot of failure. So that's the first part, is to really show you what that looks like. The second part is to show you the deep social forces, how the money flows. Because so many things in life you really want to understand. As a wise man once told me, when I really wanted to understand how the university worked, I radio labeled a dollar bill.
Was Alan Vinook?
That was Alan Vinook on this podcast, which is that when you really want to understand why people do what they do, follow the money, because that really gets at it. And so in these couple chapters, I've tried to take you through the money. And then the next section, which I think is probably the section that's most important for trainees, where we talk about medical evidence and how to assess it.
Not only trainees.
Yeah, also some senior people who have forgotten or may never have learned. You'll ask yourself, this is, how often, you were just talking recently to a first-year medical student, and they were like, well, it's obvious, like that you would want to do it this way, right?
Yeah, it was interesting because I was just explaining a concept. We will talk about that, I hope, in a future paper we have. But it's a concept that is very, very often misunderstood by our colleagues.
Yes.
And he get it, and I was so...
Very quick.
Yeah.
And I was just teaching some interns, and I was presenting this thing on crossover, and they just instantly got it. Like, oh, no, actually there, you've already established a standard of care, so you have to cross over. And here, it's a test of fundamental efficacy, so you wouldn't want to cross over. And I was like, yeah, you get it. I was like, there are people who practice for 20 years in oncology. They still don't get it. How do you get it? Why do you get it? Because to some degree, it is actually logical and obvious. So how can smart people no longer see the logic and obviousness? And the answer is part 2. That's really how they've forgotten. Like, how can you be blind to your own nose, in the mirror? And it's, it's the financial bias.
Okay, so thank you very much for doing that. I don't know if you have some final thoughts.
Final thoughts? No, we're working our way through the book. Listeners can go back. There's a playlist on YouTube that just has these episodes. If you watch on YouTube, you'll get to see our smiling faces. If you listen on the audio feed, you don't, but that's okay. There were no visuals this time.
You can buy the book?
You can buy the book, yeah. You can buy the audiobook, which is narrated by me. And now we finally fixed that problem of all the...
Chapter 11?
Where I was dreaming. Initially, there was an uncut version was put out by mistake. We fixed it. You can listen to the audiobook. You can read the audiobook, or you can read the book. If you're going into Hem/Onc fellowship...
I think you should absolutely have read this book.
Even if you disagree with everything in it, at least it will frame why people are talking about what they're talking about.
That's the beauty also of this space. There are many things you can disagree on, but that's not problematic. You can discuss, you can talk, you can push back. I mean, we are doing that all the time. I mean, with colleagues, we're often we agree, but we can disagree. That's okay. I mean, that's the beauty of this.
That's the beauty of it. And you know, I always like to learn from the people I disagree with because that's where I get the real ideas. So, on that positive note,
thank you, Vinay, and see you soon for next chapters.
Until next time.